I work, like she said, I work on the History United project. Here in Danville. I was born and raised here in Danville. And what we do at History United, we work with all of the historical and genealogical societies to inform the community of a more inclusive narrative. Because so often you only get one version of history. And so, we have a lot of untapped history and a lot of stories that haven't been told. And so that's what we do. We go out in the community and we seek out these stories that you haven't heard of, stories that I haven't heard of. Just trying to get people to have a better understanding of the African American story in Danville. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is the Danville Civil Rights Movement in particular. It's going to touch on years 1960 through 1963, and I'm going to get into 1960. I'm not going to talk about that as much as 1963, but once I get into 1963, I actually have a timeline that I'm going to follow, which I will share with you all after the talk. And once I go through the timeline, it basically starts from January 1st, 1963 on to December. And I'll touch on a few points in between. I'll start off by talking about 1960. Actually, things we've already, just like Jody Allen touched on the Danville riot, I think after the riot, just going on up through the 60s, there was always tension between the white population and the Black population here in Danville. And after, during the Reconstruction era, I think a lot of people in our community were intimidated, because you had lynchings and all types of things that were taking place through the South. So things kind of quailed down a little bit. But in the 1960s, we had a lot of radical leaders here who just got to the point that, they weren't going to stand for it no longer. So I'll start off talking about 1960. And in 1960, a group of students at the all-Black high school, Langston High School, they formed a local chapter of the NAACP, the youth chapter. And they were disgusted at the library that they had to use, which was the William F. Grassley Library, which was the all-Black library at the time. And on up the street, there was the Danville Memorial Library. Well, in that library, they were publicly funded. They had up-to-date books and resources for students. Whereas at the William F. Grassley Library down the street, they had old books and old Dick and Jane readers, books from like the late 1800s. None of the things that applied to what they needed at that time. And so these group of students, a young Robert Williams and his brother Jerry Williams with a few others, they staged a sit-in at the Danville Memorial Library. The Danville Memorial Library was also known as the last capital of the Confederacy and was known as the Confederate White House right before emancipation. So this house, one thing I'd like to say is that when telling these stories, we recognize that there are a lot of places that tell two different stories. And so something we're trying to get away from, because we have the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History, which that was the former Danville Memorial Library, the former last capital of the Confederacy. But we're telling these stories that you haven't heard of, like Jerry Williams and Robert Williams. So people can kind of get away from the Confederacy, and just to let people know that, this house which is now the museum, also tells a different story. Excuse me if I'm rambling, but let me get back into the content. But Jerry Williams and his younger brother, they staged this sit-in at the Danville Memorial Library. And as a result, they didn't integrate the library right away. What they did was they closed the library. And, you know, at the time in 1960, you had the Woolworth, the 4 A&T students that staged a sit-in at the lunch counter at the Woolworths. And so after that happened, a lot of youth all across the United States, with that fresh on their minds, they started to stage their own sit-ins in their communities where they live. So the inspiration for Jerry Williams and Robert Williams to stage that sit-in there came from Greensboro, North Carolina, which was just 40 minutes up the road. And I like to point out that their father was Jerry Williams Sr., who was a civil rights lawyer at the time. And so they had it in their blood. Their father, civil rights attorney, Jerry Williams Sr., he worked on some high-profile cases, namely the Martinsville 7 case. It happened in Martinsville, Virginia. I'll provide context on that for you as well. And he hosted people like Thurgood Marshall. And so just imagine a young Jerry Williams and Robert Williams sitting under these prominent lawyers. And so as a result, they staged a sit-in, and their father, of course, was the lawyer. They did integrate the library, but once they integrated, they took all the chairs out. So it was still a lot that they had to go through to fully integrate the library. And I would also like to say that Jerry Williams Jr., I can't forget him, because we also had a segregated park, Ballou Park, and he staged a sit-in there to integrate Ballou Park. And Jerry Williams and Robert Williams would go on to become some of the first graduates to graduate from UVA's law school. Actually, the first 3 graduates from UVA's law school was from Danville: Gregory Swanson, Isaac Cosby Hunt, and then Robert Williams Sr. The 2 were first cousins. And then the younger brother, Jerry Williams, he was the 9th graduate from UVA's law school. And so these were things that were going on in 1960, but this was just the beginning. Because in 1963, because of the events that happened in 1960, there was a group of local ministers here that formed the Danville Christian Progressive Association, known as the DCPA. And so they were formed as, because they were a group, they wanted a radical change. They were looking for a radical change, and they got together to organize in sit-ins. And excuse me, they organized to stage sit-ins because they wanted, at the time, we didn't have Black police officers and we didn't have Black firefighters. So they got together to form the organization to bring about a change. It was time for a change, you know, and they were tired of the old segregationist ways that we had here in the city. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read from a timeline, and I'm going to go down I'm going to interject as I read down the timeline when I come to some important pieces that I think, you know, I need to go in on. Okay, in January 1st, the Danville Christian Progressive Association staged a sit-in at the Howard Johnson Hotel. and each of them were found guilty of trespassing and fined $100. The members of the DCPA was Reverend Campbell, Dr. Chase, who was the pastor at the High Street Baptist Church, which was the first African-American Baptist church formed in the city after emancipation, but it was also a safe haven for Black people during the Civil Rights Movement. And these young ministers, they formed the Danville Christian Progressive Association, and they got connected with the SCLC, the Southern Leadership Christian, the Southern Leadership Christian. Bear with me. I'm trying to think of. I'm sorry. Just bear with me, okay? Okay. On March the 26th, they invited Martin Luther King to speak here, and it was the first one of 4 times that he came into the city to speak. And he spoke at the Danville City Auditorium to a crowd of over 2,500. And it was during that speech that he said that Danville had one of the most brutal police forces that he had ever seen. On May 31st, the demonstrations began peacefully. And the Reverend Lawrence Campbell and Reverend Dunlap, who were leaders of the Danville Christian Progressive Association, they organized and led demonstrations. No arrests were made, and the press ignores the event. On June 5th, police, they ousted 125 demonstrators who marched into City Hall and the city manager's office. 5 were arrested. Before I go into the rest of the timeline, I would like to read to you a song. It was a song written by Matthew Jones, who was a member of the Freedom Singers. And the Freedom Singers was a student quartet. It was formed in 1962 at Albany University State College in Albany, Georgia. And they often accompanied SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they used song. Their goal was to educate the Black community on racial injustice, and they did that through song. So one of the Freedom Singers, Matthew Jones, he wrote a song called Danville. And I'm going to read to you this song because it actually describes the events leading up to Bloody Monday, which is June 10th. He says, in Danville on June the 10th, in the year of 63, from Bible Way Church to the courthouse, some people marched to be free. As they fell down on their knees, led by Reverend McGee, he looked up and cried, "Lord, please, we want to be free." They heard the voice of Chief McCain as it cut across the prayer, and I'll never forget those violent words, "Nigger, get out of here." And as they heard those brutal words, they didn't turn around. The water from the fire hose knocked them to the ground. And as they fell down on the ground, they were hit with billy sticks. I'll never forget that terrible sound as the people's heads did split. Don't you stumble, brother. Don't you falter. Oh, mother, don't you weep. We're climbing up to our freedom, although the road is steep. On June 13th, we marched again. They used the tear gas bombs. The grand jury indicted us on $5,000 bonds. In Danville's town's corrupted courts, we got no justice done. We were found guilty before the trial, and the judge, he wore a gun. And so after June the 5th, once the members of the DCPA were arrested, Reverend Hildreth McGee, a longtime minister here, he held a prayer vigil. And he held the prayer vigil in the alley right across from the courthouse, where now the Bloody Monday marker is located. And before he could finish his prayer, the police started beating them. And years ago, my late colleague, Emma Edmonds, who was the Danville 1963 historian, she interviewed she interviewed Dr. McGee, and he had a billy club on his wall in his office, and she asked him, why do you keep that here? And he said it was to remind him of man's humanity to man, and that he had never seen anything like what he witnessed in 1963. But on June 10th, before June 10th, a special jury indicts the DCPA leaders, and a special grand jury was called by Judge Aiken. Indicts 3 leaders of the DCPA: Lawrence Campbell, Reverend Dunlap, and Julius Adams. And they indicted them under the 1859 John Brown statute, outlawing conspiracy to incite the colored population of the state to acts of violence and war against the white population. And the bail was set at $5,000 each. So I want you to think about this. This is 1963, and they were indicted on a law from 1859 that was over 100 years old. In 1859, Black people hadn't even been emancipated yet. And I just want to point out that it is 2020, and we are still fighting against a lot of these old unjust laws. So on June the 7th and 8th, faced with arrest, indictments, and injunction, the DCPA leaders called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that's it, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to ask for assistance. Before the summer is over, the SCLC will send its top leadership to Danville, and 15 SNCC workers will come to assist in the Danville movement. One of the famous civil rights leaders that came to Danville, he's often deemed as the first white civil rights activist, Dr. Robert Zellner, Bob Zellner. Bob Zellner actually wrote about Danville in his book, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek. And the chapter where he talks about Danville is actually titled John Brown, Live Like Him, referring to the 1859 statute that they were indicted on. And so Dr. Bob Zellner, he said that upon coming to Danville, also I'd like to say he was also one of those indicted. As a member of SNCC, he came to teach the people nonviolent. Well, SNCC was actually known for being more radical, but they actually came here to teach the people how to protest, different techniques like going limp, and using some of the larger women to just lay in the streets. You know, all of these things that they used, and also prepared them for going to jail, because you know, most of them did go to jail. So these were all the things that SNCC was here in town to do. And Dr. Bob Zellner, he said 2 years ago, he was here for our Teacher Content Academy, and he actually said that the press wasn't allowed in June of 1963. No press was allowed. Mother Teresa, there were so many people that were here on the sidelines protesting here in Danville. And even though the press here didn't pick the story up, the story went all around the world. Dr. Bob Zellner said that he remembered standing on the sidelines and he had a camera around his neck. And the chief of police at the time, Chief McCain, he took this camera around his neck and he stomped it. And he told all of the press that were lined up. Notice they were lined up in front of what is the Danville Register and Bee, our newspaper. And he told them, if, you know, I'm gonna do, if you all take any pictures, what I just did to this camera, I'm gonna do to you all. So even though there wasn't any local press after June 10th, 1963, this is a case that went all around the world. I also shared with you a telegram that you can go and look in the resources that was between Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And the telegram was just talking about Danville and the things that were going on in Danville. So I shared that with you so you can see that this was a national story, and this story picked up all around the world. And with the most recent passing of John Lewis, I also want to say that he was one of these SNCC workers that came to Danville during that time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that once I get to August, but I'm just going to continue with my timeline. On June 10th, Bloody Monday, demonstrations begin in the morning. Police make arrests, hose down demonstrators, and jail about 50. That evening, Reverend Hildreth McGee leads a peaceful prayer vigil to protest the arrest early in the day. And police and firemen react by attacking protesters with billy clubs and fire hoses. The day becomes infamous as Bloody Monday. Now, these fire hoses were so powerful, and the water was enough to break your skin. Reverend Campbell, who's now known as Apostle Campbell, his wife was beat during Bloody Monday. These folks are still living, 90 years old. And he actually carried a sign during the protest that said, "Chief McCain beat my wife." Miss Campbell, she still suffers from those beatings today. And I'll also share with you her testimony in court from Danville in 1967. Even though this started in 1963, I have stories of people dealing with this exact same case on throughout the 70s. Even one, a particular Archie Glass, who was one of the student protesters, he told me that years ago, he was pulled over by the police and he had a gun. And they said that he had no business having a gun, which it was registered because he had a felony and he didn't understand. And when he went to court, they brought up the events from 1963. And the judge here said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe this is still going on." He said, "You're a hero, dismissed." So I just wanted to point that out. And on June the 11th, after June 10th, the city council enacts an ordinance to limit the time, place, and size of picketing and demonstrations. On June 21st, the grand jury indicts more leaders. The grand jury indicts 10 more civil rights leaders under the 1859 statute, including officials of the SCLC's Virginia State Chapter and SNCC leaders. On July the 11th, King comes to Danville. Dr. King speaks to a large gathering at High Street Baptist Church. In an eloquent speech, he notes the brutality of Danville police and commends the courage of local protesters. On July 17th, the SNCC protest at Dan River Mills. The New York affiliate of SNCC stages a 100-person protest at Dan River Mills sales office in New York to urge the hiring and promotion of more African Americans to use the corporate power to force the city to accede to the protesters' demands. I also want to point out that Julius Adams, that was one of the members of the Danville Christian Progressive Association, he had also sued Dan River Mills 3 years earlier for discrimination. I'll provide context for that also. Okay, on August the 11th, the New York Times cites Danville's defense tactics. The New York Times recognizes white authorities in Danville for a defense strategy against civil rights protesters that is among the most unyielding, legalistic, and effective of any city in the South. So Danville was actually known for its civil rights protest and how they handled it during that time. And August the 25th, schools integrate. 11 African-American students entered the Danville Public Schools the week of August 25th under the order of the State Pupil Placement Board. The only incident is a minor traffic jam caused by 1 day of rain. And so I just want to go back to John Lewis, because John Lewis was one of the SNCC workers that came here to assist with the local demonstrations. So after they leave Danville, they left Danville for about a month because they had to prepare for the March on Washington that was to take place on August 28th, 1963. I'd like to read an excerpt from John Lewis. Danville was fresh on his mind during the 1963 March on Washington. He was the youngest and the last person to speak at the March on Washington. And I just want to read this excerpt that lists Danville in his speech. He says, "It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservations. However, unless Title III is put in this bill, there is nothing to protect the young children and old women who must face police dogs and fire hoses in the South while they engage in peaceful demonstrations. In its present form, this bill will not protect the citizens of Danville, Virginia, who must live in constant fear of a police state. It will not protect the hundreds and thousands of people that have been arrested on Trump charges. What about the 3 young men, SNCC field secretaries in Americus, Georgia, who faced the death penalty for engaging in peaceful protests?" So I just wanted to point out that we had a lot of important people to come through here. And also in John Lewis's book, he also mentions Danville and says that Danville was one of the most important parts of the civil rights movement, but it's often left out of the narrative. So on August 28th, you have the March on Washington. And then by September 24th, the SCLC held a convention in Richmond. The 7th annual SCLC convention opens in Richmond. King takes the opportunity of being on Virginia soil to announce publicly that Danville would be SCLC's next target and that a task force would be heading to the city soon. Success in Danville would do much for the civil rights movement, he says. October 6th, the SCLC plans Danville campaign. The Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, executive director of the SCLC, announces the organization's plans to start organizing in Danville the upcoming week for desegregation of hotels and restaurants and appointments of Negroes to city boards, the police force, and the fire department. On October the 16th, Danville hires the city's first policeman. After the Reverend C.T. Vivian, rest in peace, who just passed away, one of Dr. King's lieutenants arrives to organize and trains demonstrators. The Danville police chief, Chief McCain, announces the hiring of William Terry, the city's first African-American police officer since Reconstruction. This fulfills a demand made by civil rights leaders earlier in the summer. So then we move on to November the 11th. The SCLC mounts pressure. The SCLC keeps up threats of demonstrations, pulling staff out of Birmingham and Louisiana, sending them to Danville. Andrew Young, another SCLC lieutenant, reports to Dr. King that things are picking up in the city of Danville. On November the 12th, fair employment policy. 5 members of the city council, after meeting with African American leaders, agreed to put the fair employment policy on record and to hold conferences when differences occur, meeting 2 of the protest leaders' demands. November 15th, the boycott pitches. The Washington Post reports that an African-American boycott resulted in the loss of $90,000 in sales that year, and that almost all department stores now employ African-Americans. November 16th, Dr. King speaks once again at High Street. Dr. King shares the platform at High Street Baptist Church with an avowed Nazi who tries to interrupt his speech, only to have the SCLC leader says, "Let him have his say." On November the 17th, Dr. King flies back to Atlanta, but vows, we are going to be here indefinitely, referring to a task force of about 20 people who had moved into Danville. He says he will return to heal a rift that had arisen between the DCPA and the local NAACP. And I just want to touch on that. The DCPA was actually formed because they felt that the local NAACP at the time, who was headed by Dr. Doyle Thomas, who was also the pastor of a prominent African-American church, the Loyal Baptist Church. And they felt that his efforts were a little too weak and that he was a little passive. And to get things done, you know, they needed to be more radical in their approach. So after November 17th, when he said that he would return to mend the rift between the DCPA and the local NAACP, he came back on November the 21st, a few days later, and he said that we mean business in his speech. Although he doesn't set a date for demonstrations, he declares that we mean business and we will be returning back to Danville. So on November the 22nd, Kennedy is shot. As Reverend C.T. Vivian, SCLC Director of Affiliates, prepares to send teams into white Danville neighborhoods to talk about the immorality of segregation, news arrives that President John F. Kennedy had been shot. And out of sense of propriety, the SCLC abandons its Danville efforts. Now that is the timeline, and I will provide that to you all after this. So, and this is basically the whole rundown of what happened in 1963. And even though they abandoned their efforts in Danville, the civil rights movement here continued. And as a result of the civil rights movement, a lot of our places here were integrated, including the schools, beginning in 1968. So we did see a lot of progress made as a result of Dr. King coming here. And I would also like to share with you this book, Freedom Song, written by Mary King. She was one of the members of SNCC and also a freedom singer. And she talks a lot about Danville in her book and what happened. Dr. Bob Zellner, he actually, Spike Lee bought the rights to his book, and Spike Lee is actually working with him now to produce a movie on his life. And he has a very interesting story. He's the son of KKK members who went on to become a civil rights activist. And so there's so many stories that connects to the civil rights movement. We also had a lot of people here who actually moved away. They were from Danville, but they participated in movements all across the United States. One person that is, well, I say he's famous, and most people don't like to talk about this, but Clarence 13X. Clarence 13X was born in Danville in the Hallbrook Ross community, which is the African American Business District. And Clarence 13X, born Clarence Edward Smith, he left here in the 40s and went into the military. And after he retired from the military, he moved on to New York, where Harlem, New York, to be exact. And he joined the Nation of Islam. He was also a member of the same mosque as Malcolm X. And like Malcolm X, he had a lot of, as he started to learn more, he started to have disagreements with Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam would go on to say that they actually kicked him out because he was a really bad gambler. But the people in his movement said that he wasn't really a gambler. It's just that he was the type of person that would stand on the street corners and to connect with the youth that were on the street corner shooting dice, he would actually get down with them, come down to their level as a way of teaching them. Well, Clarence 13X started the 5%er movement known as the Nations of Gods and Earths. If any of you are familiar with the Wu-Tang Clan series that's been on, you can, they actually pay homage to the 5%ers. You see them standing on the corners in this series, and they're talking about science, mathematics, all of these things. And I grew up in the 90s, and in the early 90s here, we had when a lot of groups and stuff, before they came popular, they would always go to like small cities and perform. So I have a story. The Wu-Tang Clan came here in 1993. And so the drivers that drove the limo, they said, okay, where do you want to go? And they said, we want to go to Valley Street. And the driver's like, nothing's on that Valley Street but crack houses and stuff now. And there's nothing on Valley Street, And they said, we have to go to Valley Street. And so when they get out, they start kissing the ground. And so the drivers are like, what's going on here? Why are you kissing the ground? And they say, this is holy ground. You all don't even know what you have here in this city, So what is his name? Russell Simmons. Russell Simmons, who's one of the pioneers in hip hop. He also talks about Clarence X and talks about how Clarence X is a big part of the hip hop movement, the whole generation. I remember wearing the big African medallions in the 90s and all of that. So when you hear the terms word is bond and things like that, you owe those terms to Clarence 13X. You can actually Google Clarence 13X. There's a Wikipedia page about him. I'll also provide context to him as well. But I just wanted to point him out because these were people that were actually from Danville that were making moves in other places. And I don't, tell me if I'm getting close to my time, or am I still okay?
You're doing good. Yeah, you have until 11:45, so you're fine.
Okay. Okay, good. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to point out. I also wanted to say that during 1963, when the members of the DCPA were indicted, the jury was 4 people, and there was only one Black person on the jury, who was Martin C. Martin, who was the president of the First State Bank at the time. The First State Bank closed 2 years ago, 2 years shy of their 100th anniversary. And at the time of its closing, it was one of the only Black banks that was still up and running in Virginia. And the First State Bank, the banks here, the local churches, all of these community organizations, they were responsible for posting bonds and things like that for the people who were arrested. And also we had a lot of teachers in the movement as well. And with these stories that we're telling you all, we know that with the SOLs and everything, you only have a limited time to teach these things because you have to get that SOL stuff out. So with these stories that I'm telling you, if you can maybe find 5 minutes in your instruction time just to bring a little of these local Virginia stories, it'll help. I heard someone say earlier that there needed to be a mandate to have these type of things taught in the schools, and I agree. But in the meantime, you can help the students by just taking 5 minutes of your instruction time, at least once a week, just to implement some of these stories. We also had a lot of teachers in the movement who participated. They weren't always able to be out there in the front out of fear of losing their jobs. But I know of a lot of local teachers who took the younger kids outside to actually watch the protests, to show them what was going on. Some of them, when they were teaching, they said, we can't go out there with you, but we're turning our backs to you and we're facing the blackboard. So whoever wants to leave, leave, and go do these things. We had one teacher here, Dr. Beatrice Hairston. Dr. Beatrice Hairston, she actually wrote the first African-American history of Danville. And Martin Luther King, she in her house, that was the only house that Dr. King stayed at. It was a story that I wanted to share with you all. Her granddaughter, Dr. Pamela Hairston, she's a lawyer in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, I had to talk to the third graders about the civil rights movement. And because they were third graders, I came across an essay that Pamela Hairston wrote as a third grader. And she talked about how she had dinner with Martin Luther King, but as a third grader, she didn't realize who he was. She just remembered food going around the table and starting to cry because all of these men had taken all of her favorite dishes. And her grandmother was trying to explain, one day you're going to realize that you had dinner with a very important person. So she wrote this essay and she allowed me to share it a couple of years ago. But now she is putting it out there as a story that should be out sometime later this year. And so when that comes out, I will also share it with you guys because I think it is the most perfect thing to share on an elementary school level because it doesn't, it just speaks on a third grader's level, just how she was feeling at the time. And I just want to, I have a whole lot of oral histories. I have a lot of stuff that I can provide. I just don't, I know I'm a little all over the place because I know I can't cover everything, but I'm trying to make sure that I don't miss, important pieces. And I think this concludes all I have to say, but I am here for questions for the next 15 minutes or so.
I have a question if nobody else minds. Thank you for all that local history. I think it's so inspiring to find connections to local history in Virginia. I had a question for you that there's so much emphasis is put on the violence in Birmingham in 1963 as well. And a lot of people, when we're teaching the civil rights movement, sort of compare what happened in Birmingham versus what happened in Atlanta as very different outcomes of civil rights protests. Mm-hmm. I was unaware of the connection between Danville with the fire hoses, much like Birmingham. Is there a connection between the police tactics that were used in Danville and that were used in Birmingham and that they happen very close to one another? I just don't have any sense of that.
I don't know if there was a connection between the police officers, but when SCLC came to Danville and SNCC, their whole idea was to build off the same campaign for Selma. Because during that time, you had so many things were going on in Selma. You had the bombing of the 4 little girls and everything. And not only the white population, but a lot of the Black population there, even though they knew Dr. King meant well, they were tired because it's like, okay, too many people are getting killed. It's so much going on. We want equality. We want all of this, but it's just too much violence going on. So they actually, how can I put this? They actually were trying to get Dr. King to stop. And that's why he ended up, Danville was wide open for him. And so when he came to Danville, he expressed what was going on and how they didn't want him there. And so he was there to build off the campaign for Selma. So that's why you see a lot of connections and stuff, with Selma. Did I answer you?
Yes, thank you. And it's just so intriguing to see that those tactics and that violence follows those SNCC leaders where they go. I mean, that's
Yeah.
happening to John Lewis and Dr. King and Selma and Birmingham, and it's happening in Virginia as well. So it's an interesting connection.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So I sent this message privately, but you didn't have a chance. I took my forensics team out to Danville in February to go to Galileo Magnet for a competition. And when we were leaving, we noticed there was this huge Confederate flag. Like, is that due to its history and with the city?
Well, we still have those here who have not gotten over the Civil War. And years ago, we had a Confederate flag up at the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History. This Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History, just like I said, it started out as the last capital of the Confederacy, and then it became the segregated Danville Memorial Library, which is now the museum. Well, there were members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they paid upwards to $30,000 to save the museum from being torn down. It wasn't the museum at the time, but they felt that that was their house, and to preserve it and to keep it up, they actually they didn't make any formal agreements, but it was basically a handshake with the city that the UDC would occupy a house in the a room in the museum. Well, years ago, after the tensions that happened in South Carolina with the church killings and everything, there was a big war about the Confederate flag. So the city, because the museum is city's property, they decided to take the flag down. As a result, the Virginia flaggers and people, members of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, they said, okay, you want to take this little flag down that nobody even noticed before. So what we're going to do, we're going to erect flags everywhere we can. And it's not against the law to have them on private property. And so they went around and they found people who would allow them to place flags on their property. We currently have flags on every entrance to the city. And we're actually known, which is sad. A couple of years ago, this group paid at least $40,000 to erect the largest Confederate flag on Highway 29 coming from Lynchburg leading into Danville. It is actually in the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest Confederate flag. So they're being petty with the flags, but they said all we wanted was our flag was to remain at the last capital of the Confederacy. So this is what you have to deal with. And it's just an ongoing discussion here. People drive through here and they call me all the time and they're like, how do you put up with this? Because since they took the flag down, they flag every Saturday. They flag every Saturday across from the Martin Luther King Bridge, which they feel needs to be changed. The name needs to be changed. And they flag in front of the museum. The one thing I can say about the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History, they are reckoning with their past and they are changing things. We hosted the Charlottesville Civil Rights Group a couple of years ago, and that just by hosting them and just hearing the people's arguments and, just with passion and everything, the museum agreed to redo the service video that they had, which tells the story of Sutherland, Major Sutherland, who lived there at the Sutherland, well, it's called the Sutherland Mansion, the last capital of the Confederacy. And so they felt that the museum was just telling one story. And like I said before, that house not only tells that story, but it also tells a story of integration with Robert Williams and the sit-ins that they staged there when it was the library. So the museum my colleague, my late colleague, Emma Edmonds, she just passed away in February. And I learned so much from her. But she was just a little old white lady from Halifax, Virginia. And she said growing up, she didn't know anything about the civil rights movement. And when she got in college, she was just amazed at all the things that happened 30 miles down the road. So she created this exhibit on Danville 1963, and it has since been made permanent at the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History. That was the first African American exhibit, of any kind at the Danville Museum. And they've done a wonderful job. And so they're just trying to take a, different turn, and just tell every story of the house. But that's what's going on with all of these flags in the city. And it's just an ongoing, thing. And, just trying to get them to listen. We're setting up talks. We've had REI come here and do racial talks on racial injustice. We've had all types of things. We've even trying to get John Koski from the Civil War Museum in Richmond just to come here and just talk to them. Because one thing he does, he tells the story from every point of view. So we've tried all types of tactics and things just to get the people to listen and, take down the flags. But it's just one of those things.
Thank you, because my students were just really curious because we didn't notice it as much when we came in, but we definitely noticed it when we were leaving. So appreciate that. My only other question was, do you do virtual talks for classes? Would you be available?
Oh yes.
Okay, awesome.
I would like to apologize to y'all today for being all over just all over the place, but I had so much stuff and I was trying to get it, together. It's still so much I didn't share that I'm going to share with Emma so she can make sure you all get everything. But there's just so much that I didn't cover. One of the things that I've been doing here that's gotten popular are tours. I do a Green Book tour here as well as a Civil Rights tour because we do have a Green Book trail. So there's, tours. So feel free to bring, groups here. I've, had so many people. I really tell the a lot of the stories, the untold stories. This is one story that I'll tell you just because my time is already up, but I'm gonna tell you this story right quick. The Williams family that I talk about, who's just heavily, just their whole family is deeply embedded in the civil rights movement. The house that they grew up in was built by their grandfather, Robert Allen. Robert Allen's father, Robert Allen Sr., was born about 1837. He was owned by a Julius Allen, okay? Julius Allen was also he was his biological father and also his enslaver. This Julius Allen never married or had any white children. And he took a slave woman named Betsy as his wife. After, in 1862, in his will, before he passed away, he left his slave woman Betsy and all of her children to a William F. Patton, who we have a street here named after, Patton Street, which is actually where Bloody Monday took place. But he left them to his nephew, William F. Patton, and his niece. So the agreement was to leave them with them for 7 years. And after the 7 years, they were to take them to a free state, give them $3,000 and set them free. But 1865 happens, Emancipation Proclamation, and this William F. Patton says, we don't have to uphold our end of the bargain. You're free to go. And this John Allen, this Robert Allen, took William F. Patton to court. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the middle of the 1800s. The late 1800s. And even though he lost, just think of that, a Black man fresh off the, emancipation, and he actually sues this nephew. of his enslaver / father, for what he knew was to be his, for what, he had left him in the will. And so this is also a case, Allen versus Patton, that you can look up. And that's just another story. It's just so many that I can share, but I just wanted to bring that up too, because I always talk about the Williams family, because the Williams family is just a lot of, they just give me a lot of context, and they're always sending me stuff. Robert Williams Sr. passed away last year, but Jerry is still living. He's a lawyer here. He still practices, and he sends me something all the time. You can share this, talk about this, because their family grew up and they were all told to educate themselves. And out of a family of 4, 3 became lawyers. And it was their thing, we have to educate our families and never work for the white man.
Well, I do want to be respectful of your time, Ressie. But I'm just like, I feel like I've been blown away. I learned a lot today. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and especially about Clarence X. I had no idea about that. So a lot of important local history. I do want to ask one more question before you leave, because it is something that's come up a lot. And I think that you have a lot of experience with talking to the community. And so one of the themes that keeps coming up is making sure that teachers can make those community connections and get some of that community input, particularly when developing this kind of curriculum. So do you have any tips or advice for the teachers and educators that are doing this?
Can you tips on how to gain these stories?
Yeah, tips on gaining the stories and just connecting with community and getting to know people and getting their input.
Okay, well, the way that you do that is just by getting involved with a lot of these historic organizations in your communities that are actually doing this work. The local historical societies, and these are people that I partner with to get these stories. Also, one of the ways that you can do this is if you have older teachers in your schools, start by collecting their oral histories, especially teachers that were teaching back during the Civil Rights Movement. You would be surprised at the information they have as it relates to local history in your own communities. But I always start with the local historical societies and the local genealogy societies as well, because genealogists are historians in their own right. Because they research these families, they research how they live, where they lived, how they lived, and they often learn the landscape and the stories and stuff that are connected to these families that make up your local history stories. So I'd say that's connect with the historical societies and other groups that are doing this work, because a lot of times when you study history, you're studying a broad base of history. So to kind of tie these stories into where you are, just connect with the local historians to help to bring these stories into your classroom.